Picture this. You wake up before sunrise. There's no alarm, no coffee, no option to check your phone and lie there for 20 minutes pretending you're about to get up. There's just cold air, the sound of the group stirring around you, and the immediate, pressing reality that if nobody goes out today, nobody eats tonight. You're somewhere in East Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. Your group is maybe 25 to 35 people. You know every single one of them by name, by smell, by the sound of their footsteps. You've grown up with most of them. You trust some of them with your life, because that's not a figure of speech. That's literally the arrangement. This is your entire social world. There is no one else. No neighbors you could borrow from. No town 2 miles down the road. No emergency backup. Just this group, this territory, and whatever the land gives you today. Now imagine one of those 25 people decides they're not going out. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they had a bad night. Maybe they just don't feel like it. Whatever the reason, they sit down, cross their arms, and opt out. Here's the thing modern people almost never think about when they romanticize ancient life. In a group that size, every single person carries weight that is not metaphorical. A band of 30 people hunting large game needs people to track, people to drive the animal, people to cut off escape routes, people to carry the kill back. A group gathering plants needs people who know which routes are ready, people strong enough to dig, people to carry loads heavy enough that one person can't manage alone. You can run a group of 30 with 29 contributors. You cannot run it with 20. The math doesn't forgive you. There are no efficiency gains to compensate. There's no technology to pick up the slack. If a meaningful percentage of your group checks out, the group starts dying. First slowly, then very fast. This is the context that every anthropologist studying early human social behavior keeps coming back to. The question of what ancient humans did when someone refused to work is not a quirky historical footnote. It is a window into how our species solved one of the most fundamental problems any social animal faces. How do you keep everyone pulling in the same direction when individuals have their own interests, their own bad days, their own capacity for selfishness? Because humans are not ants. We don't come pre-programmed with hive behavior. We have egos. We have moods. We get resentful. We calculate. We look at the person next to us and wonder why we're carrying more than they are. That is not a modern invention. That is ancient. That is us. What's remarkable is that we figured it out. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but well enough to build the kind of cooperative societies that eventually produced agriculture, cities, governments, and somehow also reality television. The mechanisms our ancestors developed to handle the person who wouldn't pull their weight are older than language as we know it. They're baked into our social instincts so deeply that we still feel them today. The burn of being called lazy in front of others, the anxiety of being excluded from the group, the specific discomfort of being watched and judged by people whose opinion of you determines your survival. So what actually happened? What did a group of early humans do when one of their own sat down and refused to participate? The answer involves shame, exile, escalation, and in some cases outcomes a lot darker than anything a modern HR department is equipped to handle. And the evidence for it comes from a source most people never expect. Not from bones or tools or cave paintings, but from people alive today who are still living versions of that ancient life, and who are remarkably candid about what their communities do when someone stops carrying their share. You might assume the first move was violence. Someone refuses to work, the strongest person in the group grabs them by the arm and drags them along. Problem solved. But that's not what the evidence shows. The first move was something far more sophisticated, far more psychologically precise, and in many ways far more brutal than a punch in the face. The first move was laughter. Not friendly laughter, not the kind that includes you. The specific targeted social laughter that says, look at this person, look at what they're doing, look at how ridiculous they are. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, the Kung San of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Batek of Malaysia, the Ashe of Paraguay, have documented this pattern so consistently across such widely different cultures that researchers now have a name for it. They call it leveling behavior. And it is the primary social technology that small-scale societies use to keep individuals in line. Here's how it works in practice. A Hadza man comes back from a successful hunt. He killed something large. He knows it. Everyone knows it. And if he starts acting like he knows it, if he stands a little taller, talks a little louder, starts implying that maybe his contribution deserves a little extra recognition, the group responds immediately. They mock him. They call the kill small. They joke that he got lucky. They perform elaborate indifference to what he brought back. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who spent years living with the Hadza, documented this in detail. The phenomenon is so reliable, it has its own term in the literature. The meat is insulted. The successful hunter is expected to downplay his kill, and if he doesn't, the group does it for him, loudly. Now flip that scenario. Instead of someone doing too much and claiming too much credit, you have someone doing too little. The group's response follows the same logic, but in reverse. They notice. They comment. Not in a private, considerate, one-on-one conversation. Publicly. In front of everyone. With a tone that makes it absolutely clear that the entire group has formed an opinion about this person, and that opinion is not flattering. Among the Kongsan, anthropologist Richard Lee documented cases where individuals who consistently avoided work became the subject of what he described as community-wide ridicule that was relentless, creative, and clearly coordinated. People would reference the person's laziness in unrelated conversations. They would tell stories that weren't quite about anyone in particular, but that everyone understood perfectly. Children picked it up. the social atmosphere around that person changed in ways that were impossible to ignore and impossible to escape. Because remember, there is nowhere to go. You cannot leave and cool off for a few days. You cannot avoid the people who are disappointed in you. You wake up next to them. You eat next to them. You sit around the same fire every single night. The psychological weight of this is difficult to overstate from a modern vantage point. We live in cities of millions where anonymity is a resource you can draw on when social situations become unbearable. You can change jobs, change neighborhoods, change friend groups, quietly disappear from communities that have formed a negative opinion of you and start fresh somewhere else. That exit option shapes how much social pressure actually costs you. When you can leave, shame is painful but survivable. When you cannot leave, when the 25 people around you are the only 25 people in your entire world, and they have all collectively decided you are not pulling your weight, the psychological pressure is something closer to unbearable. Researchers studying social pain, the neurological experience of exclusion and public humiliation, have found that the brain processes it through many of the same pathways as physical pain. This is not metaphor. Being cast out by your group, or even credibly threatened with it, activates the same neural alarm systems as being hurt. Evolution built it that way on purpose. For most of human history, group exclusion was a death sentence. Your brain learned to treat the threat of it like a physical emergency, because that is exactly what it was. This is why mockery and public shaming were such effective tools. They didn't require the group to do anything dramatic or costly. They just required everyone to participate in a shared social signal. And that signal landed in the target's nervous system like a 5-alarm warning. Get back in line. This is serious. We are all watching you. And for most people, in most cases, throughout most of human history, that was enough. But not always. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that the leveling behavior research eventually runs into. Some people don't respond to shame. Some people sit inside the mockery, absorb the social pressure, feel the exclusion closing in around them, and still don't change. Maybe they're physically incapable and hiding it. Maybe they've calculated that the cost of working outweighs the social punishment. Maybe they have a personality structure that modern psychology would recognize immediately but that a prehistoric group had no clinical vocabulary for. Whatever the reason, they hold out. And when someone held out long enough, the group moved to the next tool in the sequence. And the next tool was considerably less subtle. Ostracism. Not the casual social temperature version of being left out. Formal, deliberate, total exclusion from group life. No food sharing, no fire access, no participation in decisions, no help when you need it. You are present physically, but absent socially, which in a world where social membership is the only infrastructure that exists, amounts to being erased. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who spent decades synthesizing data from hundreds of hunter-gatherer societies for his landmark work on human social behavior, documented ostracism as the near-universal second-stage response across cultures when public shaming failed to correct behavior. The pattern is remarkably consistent. First, you embarrass the person. If that doesn't work, you cut them off. Not permanently, necessarily. Often the exclusion was designed to be reversible, a pressure mechanism rather than a final judgment. Come back into compliance and the group comes back to you. The door is open. But it is only open from one side. What's striking about the documented cases is how coordinated this response was. It wasn't one person deciding to stop sharing food with the problem individual. It was everyone simultaneously, without a formal meeting or a vote, simply moving in the same direction. Boehm describes this as one of the most remarkable features of egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, their ability to achieve consensus-driven collective action against norm violators without any centralized authority telling them what to do. Nobody appointed a sheriff. Nobody called a council. The group simply knew and acted, and the unanimity of the response was itself part of the punishment. There was no faction you could appeal to, no sympathetic minority who might take your side. The social organism moved as one. For most people, this was the end of the road. Ostracism broke the holdout. The isolation, the hunger, the dawning reality that you were being made into a non-person by the only people whose opinions had ever mattered to you. That combination was almost always sufficient. People came back. They apologized, or they demonstrated changed behavior, or they simply resumed working without any formal acknowledgement of what had happened, and the group accepted them back with a pragmatism that was entirely unsentimental. This wasn't about forgiveness in the moral sense. It was about function. You're working again, we need you working, welcome back. But there were cases where even ostracism failed, where the individual remained defiant, or where the behavior was severe enough, persistent enough, dangerous enough, that the group made a calculation that rehabilitation was no longer the point. And this is where the historical and anthropological record goes somewhere most people are not prepared for. Boehm's research, cross-referenced with data from dozens of other anthropologists studying societies ranging from the Arctic to the Amazon, documents what he carefully terms community-sanctioned lethal punishment. Execution. Not chaotic mob violence, not one angry person acting alone, but deliberate, collectively decided, group-authorized killing of a member who had become an unacceptable threat to group survival. The cases documented across these societies share a notable pattern. They were not impulsive. They were typically preceded by extended periods of failed correction, multiple rounds of shaming and ostracism, repeated chances to change. The decision, when it came slowly, with something that looked uncomfortably like due process, given the absence of any formal legal structure. Multiple senior members would discuss it. A consensus would form, and then it would happen, often carried out by someone with a close relationship to the condemned, which Boehm notes was a deliberate feature rather than an accident. It distributed the moral weight. It prevented any single person from becoming an executioner in the social imagination of the group. Everyone owned the decision. Nobody carried it alone. The specific triggers documented across cultures are revealing. Persistent refusal to contribute during a crisis, when the group's survival margin was thin enough that one freeloader could tip the balance. Repeated theft from group resources. Violence against group members that went uncorrected. And in several documented cases, simple, sustained, defiant laziness during periods where the stakes were high enough that the group decided it could no longer carry the weight. This is the part of ancient social life that doesn't make it into the romanticized versions. The warmth of the communal fire, the sharing of food, the deep bonds of a life lived in close proximity to a small trusted group, all of that was real. But it existed inside a framework of accountability that had a hard edge. The group was not infinitely patient. The group had a survival interest that ultimately outranked the interests of any individual member. And when those two things came into direct conflict and stayed there long enough, the group's interest won. Every time. That's not savagery. That's arithmetic. When you are living 20 calories above starvation, with no margin for error and no external safety net, tolerance for sustained non-contribution is a luxury you simply cannot afford. The ancient social contract was generous and brutal in equal measure, and understanding which one you were getting depended entirely on what you were willing to give back. But here's where the story gets complicated. And this is the part that changes how you think about everything that came before it. Not every person who stopped working was a freeloader. This seems obvious when you say it out loud. Of course people got sick. Of course people got injured. Of course a woman in the late stages of pregnancy wasn't expected to run down a wildebeest. But the implications of that obvious fact are actually profound, because it means that every group of ancient humans had to solve a problem that has no clean answer. How do you distinguish between the person who won't work and the person who can't? How do you maintain the iron accountability that keeps the group alive without destroying the people who genuinely need help? How do you build a system that is simultaneously hard enough to deter defection and flexible enough to care for the vulnerable? The answer they came up with is one of the most underappreciated achievements in human history. Ethnographic research across hunter-gatherer societies reveals something that consistently surprises people who assume ancient life was purely brutal. These groups maintained elaborate, carefully observed distinctions between different categories of non-contribution. The Kungsan had recognized social roles for the elderly who could no longer hunt or gather at full capacity. They were not cast out. They were not shamed. They contributed what they could: knowledge, childcare. The kind of accumulated wisdom about seasonal patterns and plant locations that took decades to develop and could not be replaced, and the group fed them in return. The Hadza made similar accommodations. Injured hunters were carried, fed, and waited for. A man who broke his leg on a hunt was not a freeloader. He was a temporarily reduced asset who would return to full contribution, and whose loyalty to the group was, if anything, deepened by the experience of being supported through vulnerability. Boehm's cross-cultural analysis found that the threshold for serious social sanction, for the escalating sequence of shame and ostracism and beyond, was almost never triggered by incapacity. It was triggered by defiance, by the specific, legible, socially readable signal that a capable person was choosing not to contribute. The group's social radar was, by necessity, extraordinarily sensitive to this distinction, because getting it wrong in either direction was catastrophic. Punish someone who genuinely cannot work, and you destroy group trust. You signal to everyone watching that vulnerability leads to abandonment, and you lose the thing that makes the group worth belonging to in the first place. Fail to punish someone who is faking incapacity, and you open a hole in the system that others will notice and potentially exploit. The entire cooperative structure depends on the group being able to read the difference accurately and respond to it correctly. This is, when you sit with it, an astonishing cognitive and social achievement. These were people with no written laws, no formal courts, no professional class of judges or arbiters. They were making real-time collective moral assessments about intention and capacity and deservingness, and doing it accurately enough to sustain functional cooperative societies across hundreds of thousands of years. The human social brain, the part of our cognition that obsessively tracks fairness, reads intentions, monitors contribution levels, and feels visceral outrage at perceived cheating. That machinery was not built for modern offices or legal systems. It was built for exactly this, for the life-or-death daily calculation of who is carrying their weight and why. And here's where it lands on you personally, in a way that is harder to shake than you might expect. Every instinct you have around work and fairness and social contribution is ancient. The satisfaction you feel when you've genuinely pulled your weight. The specific discomfort of watching someone get credit they didn't earn. The guilt that surfaces when you know you've coasted. The anger that rises when you're carrying more than your share and nobody seems to notice. None of that is a modern neurosis. None of that is a product of capitalism or hustle culture or whatever your particular cultural moment has decided to blame for your relationship with productivity. That is 50,000 years of social evolution talking. That is the accumulated wisdom of every group that had to figure out how to keep everyone moving in the same direction, or die trying. The ancient humans who refused to work and faced the consequences were not cautionary tales from a simpler time. They were the pressure that forged the instincts you are running on right now. And the groups that figured out how to tell the difference between won't and can't, between defiance and suffering, between a freeloader and a person who needed carrying for a while. Those groups built something that turns out to be the most durable social technology our species ever produced. Not the spear, not the fire, not even language. The ability to hold each other accountable without losing the ability to take care of each other. That balance, fragile and imperfect and constantly renegotiated, is what we inherited. It is what we are still arguing about today in every workplace, every family, every community that has ever had to decide what it owes its members and what it expects in return. The conversation started around a fire 50,000 years ago. It has not ended. It will not end. Because the question underneath it, what do we owe each other and what do we have the right to demand, is not a historical question. It is the question. It always was,